Thanks a lot, and Lewis does send his regards. Just as I'm very excited to be here, Lewis was really looking forward to being here. And this is certainly a talk that Lewis put together, and we always want to acknowledge the other folks in our group, Natha Prasad and Matt Peters. We've really been working on this for a number of years, and we're excited to share a bit of our work regarding tree habitats in relation to climate change. So really, instead of thinking about an outline of where we want to go, I want you all to keep a few things in your head as we kind of go through the next 45 minutes or so, and hopefully I can maintain that timing. This idea that forests are dynamic, and that's going to play a big role in the way that we approach and think about how tree species may respond to climate change. And really, to understand these, we have to think of a lot of factors, and thinking about the land use legacy and the region and where you are within species distribution. And then the complexities of climate pressures are going to be important. And really the goal here and kind of the statement of purpose, I guess you could say, or the learning objective of the talk really is this idea that as we think about how we respond to climate change, there's both at the societal level and thinking about the bigger issue of global climate change. And then we think about how trees may respond to that. It's going to be those pressures as well as how local communities and regional communities adapt and plan and implement local management strategies. So there's a lot to be done in shaping the outcomes of how trees may respond to climate change. And it's important to hit on that first part of the land use legacy. It was something that Lewis was certainly excited to talk about. Was his 10 years or so at the Natural History Survey, where he was working in the 80s and 90s, putting out these great resources about forest resources of Illinois that many of you are familiar with, and certainly working with and collaborating with folks here at Morton Arboretum in terms of developing the Illinois plant database, that has 3,000 vascular plant records, and that website is there. But it really gives us a good sense of thinking about what is that legacy of the forest. And certainly looking through Illinois and the change in time from the 1820s on into the 1980s and 90s, we saw a reduction of forests and then the slow, gradual increase in some counties throughout the state. And so that is going to have a large influence on the way we think about climate change responses, and it's going to shape the way in which species are able potentially to shift in concert with their habitats. And especially as we get into the urban setting of what that may mean. And that's what's very exciting about this adaptation plan is of thinking and moving into the urban system. And in regards to that, this is another paper from 2000, where Lewis was actually thinking and looking at this in terms of looking at urban forests in relation to housing density and income. And two interesting things to note here, certainly in two counties that increase in forest during that time period. And really, where is that increase in forest coming from? Well, it's coming from that residential urban forest matrix. So it has a strong value to the forest component of Illinois forests. And if we look at that in relation to then in terms of to income, this idea that forest associations essentially indicating where there are more trees, and these urban forest settings are where there is that increase in income component across several of these counties, and certainly not all of them in terms of not being significant. Certainly, I think Kane County was one of those. But this idea that the forest legacy is important, it's going to be important as we think about the climate change work we'll be presenting for the rest of the morning. And so now let's think a bit about climate change. And certainly in Chicago, you all have done a great work with this, and this was something that we were able to work on back in 1998, a little bit certainly on the ecosystem sides, but this idea of a progressive action plan that's been in place, and it's really been a model for many other municipalities and communities moving across the country of thinking about and how do we deal with climate change. So that's another nice component. It's nice to return back today and then to think about what have we learned since then in terms of engaging and thinking about how our modeling approach can be useful to informing management decisions. And then why do we care about climate change? Well, there's a whole lot of reasons, right? I mean, we think about it from a from an ecological setting, certainly the dynamics and changes. Think about it from a social setting in terms of legacies and future generations. There's a lot of reasons, and you heard a lot of this yesterday of the potential impacts we're facing, certainly moving into the next 9 decades. And then Lewis always likes to show this slide, so I had to do it since this is going to be Lewis's original talk. But doing something to reduce greenhouse gas emissions has multiple benefits. Not only do we have the potential to mitigate some of those increases in changes in temperature and precipitation, but we can also have other components of changing the way in which we utilize resources and increasing livelihood of humans. So there are many reasons why this is an important topic to talk about. And so just from that work in 2008 and 2010, part of this paper that initially started looking at this region, right? And so we think about, this is a snapshot of where we're going for the future, and you'll see how results have changed a bit with our new modeling approach, but this idea that we can think about how do habitats of individual tree species potential as we move into the end of the century. And we'll return back to this in a bit later in the talk today. But I do want to spend a little time talking a little bit about the natural climate assessment. You guys spent a great bit of detail yesterday in terms of having we was talking about the natural climate assessment, being one of the leaders there. But now I want to focus just a little bit on the Midwest report, given that Lewis was one of the lead authors in that occasion, and point out just a few key tidbits of why the Midwest is so important in this national conversation of climate change, and really just pulling out those 5 highlights that make those unique attributes. First, we can think about the increases in temperature over the last century, and 3 times of that occurring in the last 100 years of increase in temperature. And then we can also think about precipitation and those increases in heavy events, and this idea of having more wetter weather and more compact time periods, right? And so we can look at this in terms of temperatures, so we project those across the temperature, and certainly a 4 or so degree potential change in climate by mid-century. And then we can look at the dynamics and the really interesting components which we see with the potential of changes in precipitation events. So longer drier spells, fewer but heavier wetter spells, and what is this going to how is this impact going to eventually influence not only forests but all the other systems that depend on these patterns. And then we can also think about water quality, right? And we heard a little bit of that as well, but again, just to highlight the Midwest and this idea of the dynamic we have with storms and more runoff, compounded with greater nutrient loading. And as temperatures warm and changing lake dynamics increase, that certainly sets up the stage for more algal blooms, more dead zones, and more fish kills, not only in the Midwest, but also if we move into the Gulf states and around the globe. And so that's certainly exemplified from last year, and then Lake Erie, around and Toledo, with the water ban happening just in August, and certainly this compounding effect of increasing phosphorus and heavy precipitation events leading to that. So certainly where are we heading? And then we think about the influence of reduced ice on the lake, certainly from 73 to 2010, that 71% decline. Certainly not in 2014, where those lakes were freezing back again, but this idea of a dynamic system and how does that affect the many components of our natural and human societies. One I guess bright spot or one component to remember is the Midwest is a wet spot, right? And this is an area where we would expect to remain and to continue to see wet conditions. We don't know what that means in terms of the lake level rises, but this idea that water should still be abundant. Then we can think about the important agricultural components that the Midwest has and contributes to the U.S. economy, and certainly this potential for increasing in growing seasons of 1 to 2 weeks. That certainly may increase yield in the near term. But what does that mean when we look at those relationships of overall production of the 2 key crops of corn and soybean, and with that increase in maximum temperature? Well, they both potentially decline. So what was realized in terms of growing season degree increases may be abated a bit by the increase in maximum temperature. So again, 2 important components of climate to think about. And then finally, what about with increases in spring warming, and then followed by those continued and remaining freezing events. Certainly we've seen that across the region, 2012 with freezing and losing significant cherry crops in Michigan, but also homeowners losing apples and pears too. So again, how does this dynamic fit into it? And the third component from the National Climate Assessment I want to point out, it's very relevant to thinking about forest and why it's important we think about the way in which forest communities respond potentially with climate change, is the idea of the importance of the mesic forests we have in the Great Lakes region. If we look at key species within that region, we see that transition zone very evident, and we also see the potential for great changes in the habitats of those key tree species, leading the stage to a need to understand how those dynamics could play out going forward. And certainly if we combine those species into individual forest community types, we can really see those demarcations of that potential shift from beech and maple, birch type forests to more suitable habitats for oak and hickory type forests. So again, reading back to the presentations from earlier of that important concept of thinking about managing for transition forests. And then another key component is the idea that Midwest is flat, right? We know that in many ways. And what does that mean when we start thinking about flooding events? And we also need to think about this concept of flatness as it relates to potential for species to respond. And if we go into literature and we look at the ability and need for species to respond to a 1 degree C temperature change in mountain areas to receive that, you can essentially accomplish that in 170 or so meters. Whereas in flat areas where we're talking about movement of latitude, to receive that 1 degree C cooler movement, it takes 140,000 meters north. So that's a substantial movement, especially when you think about the matrix of habitat that we have in the Midwest. And I think another slide, though it's complex, from the IPCC really drives this home. And you see I'm just highlighting the area up at the top there. This idea that in order for species to respond and keep up with the pace of climate change under a high emissions scenario, so where I'm pointing to, this idea of moving 7 kilometers per year, right, that's essentially going to require 110 kilometers per degree C, which is a substantial amount of movement over the landscapes that we currently have in the U.S., in the Midwest. And the fifth one and last one, which I think is an important one to bring out from the National Climate Assessment as it relates to the Midwest, is this idea of our dependence and influence of resource use and the concentration of coal and other resources within the Midwest region. And where does that set us up? Well, if we look at across the country in terms of the National Climate Assessment, the Midwest is 1/4 has installed wind energy, 1/3 in biodiesel, 2/3 in ethanol. So there's high potential for various natural resources. So there is an important message there. And then when we talk about potential impacts of climate change in the Midwest, we have to think about how this influences public health as well. And the idea that increase in temperature, certainly in excessive heat days, can have an influence on human health and well-being. And this idea of excessive heat days relating to 160 to 2,000 deaths per year in Chicago as we increase temperature through time. And another example of this, of a reason to reduce emissions, in terms of incentives, it was another important figure coming out from the National Climate Assessment report, is the idea that 11 metropolitan areas in the Midwest have half the people that had commutes of less than 5 miles were to ride a bike. What could this mean in terms of human savings? And you see Chicago certainly high enough, it has the potential to reduce deaths, 50 deaths per year, by having some sort of implementation, as well as the carbon savings that could be applied to such events. And so with that kind of in our heads of the climate is changing and impacts can be great, let's think about this in the context of forest and impacts to climate change. And in order to do this, we have to answer 3 questions. And that's what I'm going to utilize the rest of my time here today with. One is the idea of how have trees responded historically, and what is that potential moving forward? and then we'll get into the models that we've developed to think about habitat change of the next century, and then why it's so important that we integrate multiple approaches because of these complexities. So first, well, it doesn't take very hard to think about how tree communities and plant communities have changed over the last 13,000 years since the last ice age, right? If we were here 13,000 years ago, it's certainly the idea of this tundra and region, and then this open boreal forest location. Certainly very different than we have. So we certainly know tree and plant distributions have changed dramatically. And what is the cause of this? Well, there's many causes of this, right? But certainly we can't ignore the signal that climate imposes on the transition of different forest types and different forest communities going through. And so climate being a key factor of that, we can think about it from many approaches. One is just to let's think about plant hardiness zones, right? Right, and so we can look at this. We can look at from the 80s, and because of the greater resolution with climate models, we can look at and project that going forward under two emission scenarios, a low emission scenario and a higher emission scenario, right? This would be our first proxy of thinking about how trees may respond to climate change. And we can do this in terms of yearly intervals or daily intervals, but yearly to summarize that, and right, we can start with current time periods, 1980 and to 2009, right? So where we are in our plant hardiness zone, something we're all very familiar with. But then we can actually start thinking about how did these change through time. And so this is just going through really quickly of the yearly changes. And the reason why I wanted to do this is because I wanted to point out two things. One is that year-to-year variation is great, right? And that's why when we think about plant hardiness zones, we don't just talk about it from 1 year. It has a lot to do with the difference between what is climate and what is weather that apprises that. But certainly we can see going through the end of the century, so now we're up to 2070, we're almost done. But this idea of how dynamic plant hardiness zones information can be. So right, all we're thinking about here is that minimum winter temperature component. And so we can certainly have seen the colors on that map change quite a bit, from more blues to more yellows when we look at this at a continental scale, right? And so if we look at that summary, that 30-year average of plant hardiness zones by the end of the century, we see a pretty different landscape than what we currently are facing, certainly. But to look at that a little more closely, let's look at the area we care about now, right? Let's think about this in regards to the Chicago wilderness area, and what did that mean in terms of that? So if we start off where we are now, we're in this section. Thanks very much. Cold's killing me. Thank you. So now you can hear me. So if we start off where we are now, right, this is under a low emission scenario, and we can go through this in 30-year time chunks. And certainly under a low emission scenario, we certainly see changes, a shift down in terms of plant hardiness zones, which can have significant influence. But then we go to a high emission scenario where we currently are tracking in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, or we're even under on this in some regards. Where does that put us by the end of the century? So again, back to where we are currently. If we were to think about what this looks like by the end of the century, we have a very different picture of the types of plant hardiness zones. So we can start thinking about how this has an influence on tree species. Another important component to think about would be heat zones, right? So now we're going from those minimum temperatures to the maximum temperatures, right? So the number of days simply that are reaching over 86 degrees Fahrenheit per year. And we could do this same thing again, and I'm not going to make you watch that video again of the yearly changes, but we could do that. But we can let's look at this for the high and for the low and high emission scenario, right? So currently, this 2010 to 2039, 2040 to 2069, and then end of century under a low emission. Certainly some changes, some significant changes at that in terms of the number of days over 86 degrees. That still doesn't look too bad for us here in Chicago. But let's look at a more likely outcome, I would say, in terms of thinking about the emissions trajectory we're currently on. So by the end of the century, the continent looks very different in terms of those heat days. Not only does that have stress to plants, but to people as well. And just again to focus in, since everyone's probably trying to squint and see where the heck do we fit, where do we fit in this picture, right? Again, low emission scenario, certainly some changes in terms of that's that about 20 to 60 days above 86 degrees Fahrenheit, days above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And then if we go to the GFDL A1FI, which is certainly not an extreme climate model, but it's certainly following those higher emissions, we have this potential of having 100 to 139 days above 86 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a very marked change in climate. So where does that? What have we answered this first question? Right? I think we've somewhat answered this question. We know trees have changed. Hit the button. Changed certainly going back to last ice age. We know climate's important to that, and we know there's a great potential for climate to change and continue moving forward. Sorry, how much time do I have left? Okay, I have 10 minutes. Okay, thanks. Okay, I felt like I needed to figure out where I was. Okay, so now let's think about this in terms of expected species response. Well, our modeling framework is multi-pronged and multifaceted, and I'm not going to bore you with the details, but this idea that we want to look at species and their ability or potential to respond to climate change in two different primary ways. One is through a modeling approach. We're going to model at the species distribution extent. So we'll take I get my trees and birds mixed up. 134 tree species, 147 bird species, and we model these under different conditions. And then, just as Leslie was talking about before, we're going to look at the traits of those individual trees and how likely are those species to be able to follow such changes. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. There's a couple of important things I want you to stick in your head. We're not saying this is where tree species are going to go. We're talking about where their habitat would likely be suitable. There's a lot of other things that shape species distributions. The modification factors is one way in which we tend to put some bounds around that. We also have to think about dispersal and many other components that I'm not going to have as much time to talk about that today. And the last thing is, it's not just climate, right? That's only part of the story of why tree species occur, where they do on the landscape. And these models do include soil information as well as landform information. So you can go to our website. It's new and updated, and I think a lot more user-friendly than it has been. If you haven't visited it in a while, it's good to revisit it, where all this information is. We can look at potential changes in habitat through time to get a picture of the trajectories of those habitat changes. This is for sugar maple. And then we can do this for whatever species we want of those 134 tree species. And from that, if we start covering out areas and working with folks at NIAX and everywhere else to develop and to be one small part of the vulnerability assessments to give a sense for how those tree habitats may change. And our next speaker in a bit, Dr. Nowak will certainly go through the consequences, implication of these results for urban forests. But I do just want to point out just a few things here. One is the idea of we can look at the major oaks in the Chicago wilderness area, right? Whether they're talking about bur oaks or northern red oaks or white oak. And we see a dynamic and the potential change under a low emission scenario. This is an average of multiple models. And then a high emission scenario of the same tree species. And then the last one is more of the higher emissions, higher end model of the bounds. It's important to look at both the average as well as the bounds for these projections to get a sense and a flavor for how similar those changes will be across time. Right, and then we can look at minor oaks, where we're talking about, I had a good talk with with folks about swamp white oak the other day, and how its habitat may change through time. Right, so black oak, pin oak, you have to look fast because I didn't leave enough time for you to look at it, but we can always talk about that later. And then let's think about tree species potential losing habitat. Well, there's going to be a lot of those northern species, sugar maple, paper birch, and black ash. We can see their patterns of potential changes, but just again, orient yourself to current settings, low emissions, average, low emissions, high, and higher emissions in terms of how habitats may change. And so really what I want you to get across is that each species has a unique pattern and has a lot to do with the way the variables are influencing those species at the distribution extent. We're doing the modeling at that level, and then we're focusing in on specific regions to have that understanding. And then we can think about other species that are not necessarily as abundant now. Their potential for gaining in areas in habitat. We're thinking about mockernut hickory or yellow poplar, or even shortleaf pine in the extremest sense of having suitable habitat potentially within the region. Running out of time, but that's okay. So in terms of oaks from the south, again, another important thing to be thinking about. And then some potential oaks that currently aren't in the area that have potential for gaining into the south. Again, these are all ways in which we can think about how those forest communities may change in terms of suitable habitat. In order to realize that, we also have to think about there's a role of the climate pressure, and we expect that climate pressure to increase. And if we have our current forest stand, and what is that future stand going to look like? Well, it's more than just the individual species bounds of its distribution, right? They're interacting, they're competing, and disturbance trajectory plays a large role in that. Whether it's a minor or major disturbance can certainly shape the way that forest may look going forward. And that's where the modification factors come into play, where we look at these biological and disturbance traits and develop that score system that we can put then alongside our distribution models. So this was from a paper from 2011, Forest Ecology and Management. I haven't been good about mentioning the papers, but I'm happy to give you those at the end. So the idea is we have our species distribution model, and we think about how does an individual tree species respond in terms of biological characteristics and disturbance characteristics. So certainly for red maple, it's very positive, right? It can be considered a very adaptable species. As opposed to a species like emerald ash borer, right? It's a pretty easy one to do. Unfortunately, all we have to do is think about how susceptible it is to emerald ash borer. And so this is going to essentially mean, a good way to translate this is no matter what our habitat models are saying for a species like for white ash, emerald ash borer is likely going to override that in terms of the intensity and short-term impacts to realizing in terms of habitat change. So putting that alongside the models, we can then think about, again, just as Leslie was talking about, this adaptive capacity. So species like white ash having low adaptive capacity, projected declines in habitat already. Combine that with this low adaptive capacity, is certainly in this low adaptability setting. Species like red maple, even though it's projected to decline in habitat, it has such a high adaptive capacity, it's likely to do better than our habitat models would suggest on their own. And then black oak is somewhere in the middle. Right, and so we can look at this in the light. When we look at a map now, we can think about what are these other key features. And yes, maybe red maple may be able to do a bit better than it's projected. Whereas white ash, it's projected to decline, and that's likely to be compounded going forward. And so we can do this for each species. This is from northern Wisconsin, and Dr. Nock will go through this next time in terms of thinking about the Chicago wilderness area results. But it's an idea we want to put all this information out and available for folks to review and think about with their own knowledge of the system to debate and wrangle over these facts. But this provides a basis for thinking about how individual tree species may be susceptible to climate change moving forward. And it's important to note at the very end, to close up here, is this idea of the importance of urban forests. So Pennsylvania's certainly assessment really pulls this out well, and thinking about the importance that urban forests can have on reducing greenhouse gas emission influences. So right, if we think about the cost, and we can evaluate this in terms of increment of existing urban forests by increasing 10%, 20%, 50%. What are the marginal costs that we can expect to gain? And certainly urban forests are important. And we look at across all other sectors, urban forests, which was that, again, 7 group, comes out as being one of the highest in terms of marginal costs of mitigating CO2 emissions. So there's a lot of value in thinking about the importance urban forests can play in mitigating costs. So it's certainly going to be that way, thinking about that in terms of Chicago as well. So to sum up in conclusion, a couple of key take-home ideas is this idea that the climate is changing, we have a problem, we also have opportunity, right? And the Midwest is important in many features, has many unique features, and understanding that's important going into the ideas of thinking about how we may adapt and respond to climate change. And it really can't just take one approach, it has to take multiple approaches where we can look at this from many different angles to come up with the most informed decisions, and we really value and enjoy being a part of that, providing the base information for you all to figure out the tough stuff of actually what to do, right? And the urban settings are really this nice interface between humans and between people and the forest system.